I feel the British have lost the vision of God really doing something big in this country and have no idea how to do it. So the vision for the church is not very good. But wonderfully, we now have African and Latin American and Caribbean and Chinese and so on, who almost take mass evangelism and tremendous growth for granted.
Yeah.
And I believe they can be the hope for the British church.
Hi guys, Matt here from Frontiers. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Raw Mission, the podcast where we bring you challenging and inspiring stories of ordinary folks sharing the good news of our extraordinary God in some of the toughest parts of the world. Now, hopefully you joined us last week for part one of my interview with Martin Goldsmith. We had a great time discussing witchcraft and shamanism, and we were talking about the Indonesian church and then the importance of storytelling. And that's what we're going to get back to now. Part two of his interview, he's going to pick up talking about storytelling and the importance of that when sharing the gospel with Muslims.
Something else I learned in South Thailand was the storytelling.
Yes.
I remember a turning point in South Thailand where I was walking by the sea on a lovely tropical evening under the palms, you know, proper missionary life. And I was walking there with a man, Dr. Gordon Gray, who was a brilliant linguist, brilliant musician, and a brilliant preacher, quite an exceptional man. And I looked up to him. He was 10 or 20 years older than me and experienced. And I don't remember anything else he said to me, but I remember him saying that evening, Martin, if we really want to communicate to the local Malay people here, we've got to learn to tell stories. And I set out on storytelling. I started with, there was a man called Paul White who wrote books called the Jungle Doctor books. And one or two of the Jungle Doctor books, I think, are still in print, although they're very old now. And they're stories about animals. And each chapter has a different animal story, which teaches one aspect of morality, of ethics, or one aspect of the truth of the gospel. But just one aspect in each chapter. And I took over two of his chapters and their stories and Islamicized them so that they fitted South Thailand and Islam. And I noticed the tremendous impact those stories had on people. And actually my stories, these Jungle Doctor 2 stories, people would listen by the hour to hear these stories. And then they would go back to their own housing estate or village and tell the story themselves. So that these stories went all over the area, amazingly. And then in Malaysia, when I was working there, it was illegal to witness to a Muslim.
I think it's the same today, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Strongly so. And I thought, in my naivety and youth, I thought, I was just in a market town, not in the capital in Malaysia, a little town called Kluang in Johor State. And I was young and unknown, you know. I thought nobody will pay any attention to me, you know. I can get away with it. So I preached openly and among the Malay Muslim people there.
Mm.
And then finally I got a letter from the Ministry of Religion, or from the Sultan, actually, from the Sultan of the whole state, accusing me of disturbing the peace.
Oh, yes, just like Socrates, corrupting the young and disturbing the peace.
That's right. And inviting me graciously to meet with the head of the police in the state, and the head of the religious police in the state, and one other man who was also a top official. And they gave me a choice.
Yeah.
And they said, either you can give us a promise that you will not take the initiative in talking about Jesus to Muslims, or we will give you 24 hours to leave the country.
Oh, wow.
And not only you, but all the other OMF workers in the country, of which there were about 60 at that time.
Oh, no.
And I thought, imagined, me going down in OMF history as having caused the end of OMF work in Malaysia. I thought that was not the best heritage to leave.
Oh, gosh. So what did you say?
And I thought, well, it's not biblical to say I won't witness to 50% of the population.
Yeah.
Unbiblical. You can't do that as a Christian. But then I thought of storytelling again, that I could tell stories that wouldn't talk about Jesus.
Yes.
But might lead to it.
Yes, it's fishing.
They ask questions.
Yes.
So I wouldn't be taking the initiative in teaching about Jesus. I'm telling stories, religious stories.
Yes.
And I gave the promise, and I knew I was carefully watched. I could see it. But I started to tell stories. I took over one or two of the parables of Jesus. I'm hopeless at making up my own stories. So I quite clearly plagiarize other people's, but I change them and adapt them culturally and religiously.
Yes.
So I used to tell the story of, my favorite one was of a very wealthy millionaire top Muslim going to the mosque and praying, and he knew how to do his washings perfectly, and then his Arabic was brilliant, and all his movements fitted the wording of the Muslim prayer perfectly, and he prayed just brilliantly. But unfortunately, while he was praying, his mind wandered, and he began to think about the pretty girl at the end of the road and was quietly undressing her while he was praying in his mind. But his Arabic was beautiful, and his prayers were perfect, and just excellent prayers. But the human mind can go astray and wander. But it happened at the same time that there was a poor old beggar Muslim who'd begged all his life, and he didn't pray, and he didn't pay his tithe, his zakat, or anything like that. He was not a good Muslim, but he realized suddenly that actually God had been amazingly good to him, and he'd always had just about enough to cover his body and in clothing, not good clothing, but enough, and always had just about enough to keep body and soul together in food. And he wanted to thank God for it. But he just didn't know his way around prayer. And anyway, he went to the mosque to thank God. And he knew you went to the washing room first, but couldn't remember how you do your washing. Do you do the arms from the end of the hand up to the elbow, or do you start at the elbow and go down to the hand? And do you keep your hand with the fingers open, or do you close them, or what? And how do you wash out your mouth? And do you wash out your mouth before you cover the head, or do you cover the head first and then wash out the mouth, etc.?
Yeah.
He couldn't remember. And of course, the crowds love to tell you because they know.
Oh, yeah.
And you actually know too, but never mind. And then he went into the mosque to pray. And of course, he couldn't remember any Arabic and had no idea how to pray. But he went behind one of the pillars and squatted down there. And in Malay, not in Arabic, just thanked God for how good he'd been to him. And then I asked people, which man's prayer did God actually like best? And the answers were very, very interesting. Most people would answer, well, obviously the first man. Unfortunate that his mind went wrong.
But at least his Arabic was good. At least he knew when to stand and when to kneel.
Yes, he was obedient to the call of God. He did what was right. His prayer was perfect, exactly the will of God for him.
Yeah.
And unfortunate that he was doing that.
So the beauty of storytelling is you can subtly challenge existing thoughts and patterns, much as Jesus did with his parables. And he wasn't preaching a theology that was formed, and he knew who he was, and he knew what was coming with the cross and the resurrection. But he gently introduced these stories that would draw out the seekers.
And Muslims feel it's the externals that are primary.
Yeah.
But actually, you have no gospel until people realize that the heart has gone astray.
Yes.
And that actually the heart is more important than the externals.
Exactly. And this is, I suppose we could call this subversive storytelling. You're introducing gospel themes and biblical themes. You're trying to look for the seekers who are hungry and will come to you afterwards and say, well, tell me more. Just as the disciples did sometimes with Jesus. We don't understand. What are you talking about? But that's who you're looking for, isn't it? Especially in a country where the authorities are all over you.
I would have people come back to me and say, you're trying to tell me something, aren't you?
Yes.
Or tell us something. And then you could discuss a bit further. I have been stoned 3 times in my life.
Wow.
And once was a Muslim crowd. And that sort of godless young person enjoys getting violent against a Christian preacher, even though their own Islam, it may be quite weak.
Right.
But they enjoy it. It's fun.
Yeah.
Throwing stones at a Christian, you see.
Yeah.
Actually, I kept the young people on side with me because they enjoyed my stories, rather than having them stone me.
Gosh.
And still opening the door that they might come back for more.
Yeah. So on those occasions when they threw stones at you, how serious did that get? Did you feel in danger of your life, or did you manage just to get away quickly? How did that pan out?
Well, we ignominiously ran.
Yeah. Well,
managed to escape. I mean, I was bruised, but not more.
Okay. I mean, it's biblical. Sometimes it's biblical to run, isn't it? When they persecute you in one city,
and it's also biblical not to cast your pearls before swine.
Correct.
Or mad dogs who will just bite you.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah,
but
wonderful.
I think with people who are not ready for the gospel, if you preach the gospel openly to them, the only thing they can do is say no, whether violently or not, but say no. And saying no to the Lord is a hardening experience.
Yeah.
So you actually make it harder for them to become Christians later. So I don't want to do that.
Yeah. If they're not ready. Yeah. There's a time to move on and wait. Yeah.
So storytelling, I think, is very, very important. And actually, I noticed in Britain today that storytelling has become the way of arguing.
That's right.
You know, if you discuss in Parliament about, I don't know, euthanasia, for example, you don't discuss the biology of it or the medical of it, you know.
Or the ethics.
And the philosophy of it or religion of it. You tell a story about some guy who's, you know, suffering most terribly and longing to die.
Yes.
And, you know, and now you're denying it from him.
That's right. You tug on the heartstrings, and it's interesting, isn't it? This is the postmodern world. Yeah, we're not debating truth or not truth. It's what's my truth and my feelings, and how does that impact?
And particular stories speak.
Yes, that's right.
So we've got to learn as Christians, not just among Muslims, but particularly among Muslims, to tell stories effectively, which is why I've written my book on storytelling.
Yes. Yeah, gosh, we haven't touched on your books. How many books you and Elizabeth, between you, how many have you written?
I've never counted, but it's about 30, I think.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I've read one or two of them, and you're always full of great stories. And but also, you guys are sharp thinkers. You're missiologists, you're theologians, and you think in different cultures. And there's a lot of wisdom for us to learn from you guys.
Yes, I do feel that our training courses have got to learn just for ordinary British training, the Bible colleges and theological colleges have got to become much more multicultural, not just in personnel, but in their teaching and syllabus and understanding of scripture and so on. And I feel that the All Nations training, which is why I joined the college there, I feel All Nations has got something to offer for people, being multicultural in its teaching, in its syllabus.
Yes, it's a really important... It's a great thing. And, one of the things that is going well in the world right now is this understanding that there are many voices that haven't been heard over the decades, whether in theology or whether in ethics or whatever it is. But, we are, I think, beginning to listen more effectively to very important voices from Sri Lanka, from Latin America, China and Korea.
Absolutely. Now we want good theology, and particularly good biblical knowledge, and ability to communicate scripture in other cultures, because we are such an intercultural world now, including Britain. Even our village of Stansted Abbots here next to All Nations, it's just a village which, if we'd been talking 30 years ago, I would have said is very conservative, small c and big C and any other C. And, as a Jew, I was the only non-ethnic English here. But now we have, Cuban living opposite me, Black Cuban, and there's Bangladeshi and Iranian and Chinese and
it's beautiful, isn't it?
Caribbean, of course, and all sorts.
Yes, so much for us to learn, from meeting different cultures, but also opportunities where people don't have a chance in perhaps if they've come as new neighbors, recent immigrants. They may have come from countries where the gospel isn't available, isn't accessible in their language or in their culture. So we do have an amazing opportunity to love those around us and show them God's love here too.
Yes. I think, too, that when I look at the British church, I feel the British have lost the vision of God really doing something big in this country and have no idea how to do it. So the vision for the church is not very good. But wonderfully, we now have African and Latin American and Caribbean and Chinese and so on, who almost take mass evangelism and tremendous growth for granted.
Yeah.
And I believe they can be the hope for the British church in the future. Right.
Yeah, we look at the history of Korea. I mean, how the church has grown there or in China in the last 50 years.
Now, of course, it's going down, unfortunately.
Is it? But you look at the growth of the church in some of these parts of the world, and then they come to Britain, they say, why not here? God is the same God. He can revive and restore and do something with the church here. Why not?
Yes, I used to go to Korea every year for mission training. And every year they would put on a stadium meeting for mission while I was there. And they were always between 20 and 40,000 people.
Wow.
And I would preach at that. And they didn't think twice about it, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, perfectly normal. Here in Britain, if we had a meeting of 20, 30, 40,000 for a missionary meeting, we'd be a little bit surprised, I think.
Yes, although you say that, I've heard about the Send. I don't know if you've heard about it. Started in Florida and then into Brazil, and they filled 2.5 stadiums in Brazil. Everyone said you won't fill one, and nobody will come.
But not Western.
It's not Western, you're right. And I don't know if you've heard, but they're doing one in Norway this summer, and they're trying it.
Yes, I've heard.
So that's very exciting. And maybe in a few years, we could bring one to Britain and gather the churches to. And what do you think? I mean, you mentioned the British church, just generally in terms of the gospel here in our land, but in terms of thinking about the nations, the unreached people, that third of the world who don't, have access to the gospel. We might call them gospel deprived or gospel neglected. How do you have any words for the British church and in terms of, getting over our post-colonial angst and guilt or giving up on mission because, well, that's the job of the Chinese and Koreans and Latinos now?
Yes, I mean, on the angst business, there are things to confess, obviously.
Yes, absolutely.
We should unashamedly confess them.
Yes, the horrors of colonialism.
But I think we also need to look realistically and see that actually there were positives in colonialism. People, even to say it sounds just terribly right-wing and awful. But actually it's true. I've worked in Thailand that was never colonialized. And the backwardness until recently when Western approaches have come in and brought modern medicine and modern education and modern industrial approaches and so on. But until then, nothing changed, for 1,000 years.
Right.
And education and medicine and approaches to women and so on.
Right. Yeah.
Shocking. And morality down the drain. And there were a lot of good things we brought as well as bad things.
Yes.
And bad approaches. And actually there were colonialists also who were good. We owe a lot in Indonesia to Sir Stamford Raffles, who was a colonialist there. And Singapore, of course, honors him enormously.
Yes, hotel chains.
But I mean, he was a colonialist.
Okay.
You hardly dare put that title to him, but that's true.
Yeah.
I think we've got to be more historical.
Yes, more nuanced.
People also don't say that actually slavery depended on the African tribes selling their people to the whites. So if the African tribes had not been involved in slavery themselves, the slave trade could not have existed. And of course, the Arab slave trade preceded the Christian one and the Western one.
That's right.
That, you know, if you look at the population of Yemen and Saudi and so on now, you'll see lots of black faces. And those come from slaves who've become Muslim there. And actually, when I went to Mali on my first visit back in the 1983, I think it was, one of the missionaries in West Mali stopped me on the street and said, by the way, you can tell the difference, can you, between a slave and a free person?
If you're enjoying this podcast, why not give us a 5-star rating so that more folks can hear these inspiring stories and join us in praying, sending, giving and going? Or how about inviting me or one of my colleagues to speak at your church? I'd love to hear from you. Email me on matt@frontiers.org.uk. And now back to the podcast.
And actually, when I went to Mali on my first visit back in the 1983, I think it was, one of the missionaries in West Mali stopped me on the street and said, by the way, you can tell the difference, can you, between a slave and a free person?
Oh, gosh.
I said, are the slaves? He said, oh, yes. Can you not tell? I said, no. And he stopped me by the side of the road. And as people passed, he would say, just look at the clothing of that man. Do you see this and that? That man's a slave. And do you see this and that on that other man? Oh, he's free. And women the same.
Yeah, there's so much. I mean, bondage slavery in Pakistan with the brick kilns.
Yes, Mauritania had a slave market as late as 1979.
Wow. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yes, you could go down to the market and you couldn't buy anything else at that market, but you went around picking which human being you would buy.
Let's return just to the question of the nations, global mission, and it's easy in post-Christian Europe, perhaps, to think, oh, there's so much to be done here. I mean, our Jerusalem, our Judea is just so, ungodly in many ways, and the gospel is not really even understood by British people around this country. So, Martin, should we give up on sending to the nations because we have so many nations amongst us, because there's so many secular-minded folks around us?
We should be sending people in their professions, which is absolutely normal. All 3 of my children travel in their professions. One in business and one in coaching and personal relationships, and one for specifically Christian things and ecological issues, Ruth Valerio. But travel is so normal, and British people are going on holidays and business and everything else overseas, and intermarriage is so common, so people go and visit in-laws and so on.
But it's still not sending. It's not setting apart people for gospel work in unreached places.
Then I was going to say we need that as well. Because those sort of people tend not to learn the language and not to learn the culture effectively. So, and they're very busy in their banking or their whatever.
Yes.
So they don't have much time or much energy for specifically spiritual issues. And so I think we also need full-time missionary sending without any shame. And they need to be well-trained, well-prepared, so that they are effective cross-culturally. And we need long-term people who really go deep in the culture and deep in the language.
Yes. Yes, and of course, if there is a local church, then to partner with them and learn from them and so on. But there are still many places where there is no local church to work with. And so there's still a need for pioneers in some areas.
I think actually every country now has churches, even Mauritania and even the Maldives now have churches. And I would emphasize work with the churches, but in order to stimulate them and to work with them in outreach to the unreached. When I first went to Singapore, we as missionaries worked among the Malays directly with very little result. In fact, no result. No fruit anyway. And then we realized there were, in those days, about 200, now a lot more, Chinese and Indian churches who had no interest in Malay work.
Yes.
They didn't relate to Malays at all. But of course, they went to school with them and worked with them and so on. So they related naturally, even though they weren't interested and didn't make friends. And we began to work among the Chinese and Indian churches to stimulate mission among Muslims. And that has been much, much more effective.
Yes.
Even though culturally the gap between Chinese and Malay is horrendous.
Yes,
that's worse true. Than Malay to British.
Yes, that is true, because they wear very different clothing, don't they? And eat different food. And yes, there's not a lot of, but we can encourage them to, well, what about making bridges? And what about sacrificing some of your own cultural values or practices to be a bit closer to the Muslim Malays?
Yes. We faced in Indonesia all sorts of cultural issues. One was the whole question of our relationship as a husband and wife. Just what we can do together visibly to the world.
Yes.
And what we can't. We faced it particularly with, we didn't have running water, but we were graciously allowed to take water from a pipe between 6 and 6:30 a.m. if it ran in the mornings. And we carrying water in that culture was women's work. But actually carrying large buckets full of water is very, very heavy.
Yes.
And when a girl is pregnant, particularly the last few months, that's actually quite dangerous. And so we debated amongst just the two of us, you know, should Elizabeth go out and queue for water, or should I go out? And in our culture, obviously the man goes. But in their culture, obviously the woman goes.
Yes.
Well, we decided in that case, I should go. And it was a bit funny. You know, the women all came to me immediately and said, "Oh, is Elizabeth sick?" And I said, "No, but in England, British men also have muscles and can carry water." And so, and it's not healthy, and
yes.
So I'm going to carry it. And so we would have a queue of women, and then a gap, and then me, and then another gap, and then women that came after me. But that spread. That men could also do physical work, which had never been done before. On the other hand, in church, the men sat on one side, the women on the other.
Yeah, same in Pakistan.
Yes, and we felt we should follow that.
Yeah.
And, we didn't hold hands. We didn't look at each other in public at all. Even the way I'm looking at you now in the eyes, that would have been quite immoral to do that with Elizabeth.
Yeah, even public. As your own wife. Wow.
Yes, and I normally didn't speak to Elizabeth in public because that was not what they did.
Wow, that's a big sacrifice for Elizabeth.
Yes,
especially.
So, if I wanted to ask Elizabeth something in the presence of other people, local people, I would say, I think Elizabeth will bring some drinks or something. Rather than saying to Elizabeth, could you please?
Wow.
And I would hear our neighbors who were also newly married at the same time, and just the two of them living in the house next door. And they would never speak to each other, even in private, in their own home.
No way.
They always addressed the wall, and they would say, "Oh, wall, such and such." And the other one would then reply to the wall. And they
never heard that. That's extreme.
Through the wall. We didn't do that, but we did do it sort of indirect speech.
Yes, in public.
And so, all sorts of things that you want to ask yourself, what in local culture do you feel is really unbiblical and needs to change?
Yep.
And other things in the culture that you say, well, that's the way they do it, and okay, we'll fit in.
That's right. Much as Daniel and his friends had to do in Babylon.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. Type of food and so on.
Yes. So we don't even really understand why they said no, do we, to the king's meat? But somehow they drew the line. They were okay to take on the names of idols, Belteshazzar and so on. And
yes,
even their Jewish names were left behind. They seemed okay with that, but they would not. They drew a line in the sand. They would not eat that meat for some reason, whether it was sacrificed to idols.
They even took over the name for God.
Yeah.
In the local religion.
Yeah.
Because the Babylonians used the word Elah for the creator. In their animistic tribal Babylonian religion. And Elah is carried over into the New Testament, into the Old Testament even. You find it used once in Jeremiah, and it is the common word for God in Ezra.
Wow. That's so interesting. And that's interesting when you're talking about Muslims and can we use the word Allah and so on and use these Arabic terms for God or not? And I often say, well, not just look at the Arabic church over the centuries who've used those names, but look at scripture too. Theos in the New Testament, that came from the Greek pantheon. That was not, nobody went around saying Yahweh as they wrote the letters, the epistles.
We in Europe have done that because actually we worship God.
Yes,
who
German.
Was God.
German, wasn't it? Or Norse or something, yeah.
Well, God, yes. He was the high creator deity of the pagan British tribes before the coming of Christianity.
Exactly. So
and we took that over, but gave it a biblical understanding.
That's right.
As the Old Testament does with El.
Yes.
And Elah.
Right.
Yes.
So we can reinterpret by who is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, whatever we call him in our language.
And you mentioned Norway just now.
Yeah.
Very interestingly, not in Norway, but across in Sweden, they have in Norway too, they have a very big midsummer festival. And they celebrate midsummer with big conferences, big get-togethers, jamborees, and so on, and secular and also Christian, including the very evangelical Christians. And in the Swedish ones, they celebrate midsummer by having a big lump of wood covered with leaves, and they dig a hole in the top of the wood, and they put a big cross up on it, and the cross is also covered with leaves. And in the branches of the cross, they have a circle underneath the cross, the fertility symbol. And then the unmarried girls go into the forest. Very evangelical, this. The evangelical conferences. Unmarried girls go into the forest dressed in white.
Wow. And
they collect wild flowers and make themselves a little coronet out of the flowers. And then they dance around the altar.
Interesting. Very Midsummer Night's Dream.
And this was a pagan festival where the gods were considered to be male, but didn't have any females. Wow. And so some of the virgin girls would go out into the forest dressed in white, purity, and collect flowers. And then they would dance around the altar. Notice all fertility covered with leaves and the fertility symbols under the cross things. And having danced, they would then be sacrificed to the gods.
Wow.
Human sacrifice.
My goodness.
So that the gods had girls that they could use, and that would produce babies for the tribes.
Yeah. Okay.
And the cattle would also be fertile.
Yeah. Wow. And they've reinterpreted these pagan traditions, and they're still using them in the evangelical church today in Sweden.
And now it's the heart of an evangelical festival.
Yeah. Interesting. Much as we've done similar things to Christmas and Easter in this country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Neither of which are biblical, eh? We're going to get some trouble now.
Surely biblical to have Easter eggs and rabbits, isn't it?
Exactly. And lots of shopping and Boxing Day sales. Nothing to do with fertility gods.
And I'm sure the German Lebkuchen are definitely biblical.
Martin, it's been such a joy to have you on this morning. I've loved hearing some of your stories. You're a fantastic storyteller, and your challenges to us. Could you, any final tips, or can you recommend, some of the books that you and Elizabeth have written to us?
Yes, I think people will enjoy and benefit from our life stories. Elizabeth, my wife, Elizabeth Goldsmith, has written her life story, God Can Be Trusted, it's called. God Can Be Trusted. Just a cheap paperback. And that speaks a lot of her experience in a Japanese prison camp in the Second World War, and particularly our experiences in the fast-growing churches of Indonesia. And I think people will enjoy that very much. And I have written my life story, Life's Tapestry, it's called. Again, just a paperback, so not expensive. And that's got my conversion and a lot of international perspective as well. So I hope people will really enjoy that and learn from it. I've also written a book called Storytelling, which goes through what we talked about and has lots of examples of different stories that you could use. Both Brilliant. Jungle Doctor books and also some of the parables and so on, and some of the principles of storytelling and how to do it. So I hope people will find that really helpful, just for witness in Britain, let alone among Muslims. I've also written a book on relating to Muslims. It's called Beyond Beards and Burqas, Burqas. The clothing that covers a woman in Islam. And it's the story of my encounters with a lot of different Muslims of very different backgrounds. And in each case, I give one major conversation I've had with them about Islam and the Christian faith. And I hope people will see how to communicate with Muslims more effectively through that. And it's an easy book to read because it's just these personal encounters beyond beards and burqas.
Fantastic.
And a whole lot of others. You can see the whole list on my website. And my website is martingoldsmith.wordpress.com. And I do a weekly blog, which is a biblical exposition, and my Jewish perspective and mission perspective will come out. I hope people will enjoy that. I'm going through Romans at the moment.
Great. Thank you. We'll mention some of those books definitely, and the website and so on, that will connect people to you so they can find out more about your writings and your story, and your blog sounds fantastic as well. So we'll put a note of some of those things in the text that goes alongside this episode. But thank you, Martin. Thank you for your time this morning. It's been great chatting to you.
Just great to be with you, and so enjoyed you, Matt, in these encounters that we've had.
Thank you, and God bless, and happy anniversary next week.
Thank you very much. Blessings on you.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope today's episode has been inspiring and challenging. For more, check us out on our website, frontiers.org.uk, and on all social media platforms @FrontiersUK. Have a great week, and make sure you don't miss our next episode.